The developments emerging from the Lebanon Valley over the past hour could prove to be one of the most consequential battlefield incidents of this conflict, provided the current reporting is ultimately verified. Multiple sources are indicating that 22 Israeli officers, including battalion and company level commanders, were killed during what appears to have been a highly coordinated Hezbollah ambush in the valley south of the Litani River. Initial accounts further suggest that an Israel Defense Forces infantry battalion deployed on forward operations across the valley's difficult urban and agricultural landscape was rendered combat ineffective after a single engagement. According to the earliest reports circulating through open-source channels, the entire encounter unfolded in under 40 minutes. If that timeline is confirmed, it would represent the destruction of a military formation that required years to recruit, train, organize, and deploy, all neutralized in less than an hour. It is important to be precise at this stage. These reports are still emerging, and the information environment surrounding this conflict has been contested from the very beginning. Speculation should never be presented as established fact. What we do have, however, are several converging indicators. Reports from Lebanese media, updates from monitoring accounts that have demonstrated reliability during previous engagements in this theater, and a noticeable shift in the communication pattern of the Israel Defense Forces over the past 90 minutes. Those who have closely observed Israeli military communications over many years will recognize that pattern immediately. When the IDF is dealing with a major tactical setback, it rarely confirms events in real time. Instead, official communication often falls unusually quiet while information is verified and operational decisions are made. In situations like these, silence can itself become a meaningful signal. Tonight, I want to examine four central questions that define the significance of this developing situation. First, if these reports prove accurate, how was Hezbollah able to execute an ambush capable of killing 22 officers and disabling an entire battalion in less than 40 minutes? What does the structure of such an operation tell us about the depth of planning and preparation behind it? Second, what are the operational consequences for Israeli forces in the Lebanon Valley after losing so many officers during a single engagement? At what point does a battlefield setback of this scale begin to affect the wider campaign beyond the immediate area? Third, why are Washington's options in responding to an event like this so limited? What does that reveal about the gap between America's strategic commitments to its allies and its ability to shape events as they unfold on the battlefield? And finally, when an ambush of this magnitude occurs in a conflict already operating close to its limits, where does the escalation ladder lead next? And who ultimately controls the pace of events? Stay with me throughout this analysis because the answers extend far beyond the Lebanon Valley itself. They challenge several assumptions about this conflict that much of the mainstream coverage has either overlooked or chosen not to examine in any meaningful depth. Let us begin with the tactical picture, because destroying an infantry battalion and killing more than 20 officers in under 40 minutes is not simply a matter of opportunity. Operations of this nature require extensive planning, disciplined preparation, and exceptionally precise execution. Whatever conclusions one reaches about the wider conflict, this engagement deserves careful military analysis on its own terms. The Lebanon Valley presents one of the most demanding operational environments in the region. Its southern approaches, where the valley narrows towards the Israeli border, create a landscape that poses significant challenges for any conventional military force conducting offensive or patrol operations. Much of the valley floor consists of open agricultural land interrupted by irrigation systems, orchards, tree lines, and scattered villages. Farm compounds, industrial facilities, and residential structures provide extensive concealment for defenders, while offering comparatively little protection to troops advancing through exposed terrain. Above the valley, the elevated ground dominates the battlefield. The western ridgelines leading towards the Mediterranean coast and the eastern slopes stretching towards the anti-Lebanon mountains provide commanding observation over almost every movement below. Any force that secures these positions while embedding additional assets within the villages and infrastructure across the valley floor gains a decisive tactical advantage. In such conditions, battlefield success is not necessarily determined by numbers. It depends on patience, preparation, careful positioning, and the ability to strike from several directions simultaneously at the moment of one's own choosing. The emerging reports are broadly consistent with a style of operation that analysts who have followed Hezbollah's military development over the past 2 decades would immediately recognize. According to the current picture, the Israeli battalion was conducting what had become a routine patrol and clearance mission in this sector. If previous patterns hold true, Hezbollah may have spent days or potentially even weeks preparing the engagement area before Israeli forces entered it. Initial accounts suggest that the attack was launched simultaneously from at least 3 separate directions. Fire reportedly originated from elevated positions overlooking both sides of the valley, while additional concealed elements engaged from prepared locations within the valley floor itself, positions that had apparently remained undetected before the Israeli advance. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these reports is the unusually high number of officer casualties. 22 officers killed during a single engagement lasting less than 40 minutes would not normally occur through chance alone. Such an outcome would strongly suggest that the attacking force possessed detailed intelligence regarding the battalion's command structure, vehicle disposition, and leadership positions before the engagement even began. Military analysts have long noted Hezbollah's extensive use of anti-tank guided missile systems, particularly the Cornet, which has featured prominently in conflicts with Israel since 2006. With an effective range of up to 5 kilometers and considerable precision, the system enables concealed teams positioned on elevated terrain to engage specific command vehicles and control positions with remarkable accuracy. If these casualty figures are ultimately confirmed, the implication is significant. It would suggest that Hezbollah had already identified where senior officers were likely to be positioned within the formation, pre-selected firing positions to engage those locations immediately, and coordinated multiple strike elements to prevent commanders from dispersing or reorganizing once the ambush commenced. That level of coordination is not improvised. It reflects a targeting process built on sustained intelligence collection, detailed observation of operational routines, identification of command vehicles, and careful study of patrol patterns over an extended period. Gathering that intelligence may require weeks. Executing the plan itself may take only 40 minutes. That contrast between long-term preparation and rapid battlefield execution has become one of the defining characteristics of Hezbollah's military approach throughout this conflict. Understanding what it means for a battalion to be declared combat ineffective requires looking beyond the casualty figures themselves. Such a designation does not simply indicate that a unit has suffered heavy losses. It means the battalion has lost the ability to function as a coherent fighting force. Its command structure has been shattered, its communications network disrupted, key weapon systems neutralized, and the soldiers who remain are operating in conditions far removed from anything they were trained to manage. Those who survive an engagement of this scale are no longer functioning as a unified battalion. Instead, they become isolated individuals and small groups trying to establish what has happened, identify where the threat remains, determine whether their commanders are still alive, and decide how to proceed without the leadership that normally provides direction. That period of confusion and paralysis is not simply a byproduct of the ambush. It forms part of the attacking force's operational objective. From Hezbollah's perspective, the first 40 minutes would represent only the opening phase of the operation. The real opportunity begins immediately afterwards, when disorganized survivors are at their most vulnerable. Any Israeli reinforcement attempting to reach the battlefield would be forced to move through terrain that may already contain additional prepared positions, while the close proximity of surviving Israeli personnel to the ambush site would significantly restrict the use of air power without creating unacceptable risks of friendly fire. The reported officer casualties deserve particular attention because their significance extends well beyond the immediate tactical picture. If 22 officers have indeed been killed during a single engagement, the consequences reach into the operational and institutional foundations of the Israel Defense Forces. Israel maintains a highly professional officer corps built within a relatively small military establishment supported by compulsory national service. The quality of its leadership is widely recognized, but its pool of experienced battalion and company-grade officers is not unlimited. Losses on this scale cannot be replaced quickly without affecting formations elsewhere. When an army loses officers at this rate, three consequences unfold simultaneously. The first is immediate and tactical. The command structure of the engaged battalion collapses, leaving surviving troops without effective leadership during the most critical moments of the battle. The second consequence is operational. Replacement officers must be drawn from neighboring formations or reserve commands, inevitably weakening those units as experienced leaders are redistributed to restore capability where the losses occurred. The third consequence is institutional, and arguably the most significant over time. Officers throughout the wider force begin reassessing the risks associated with operations in this environment. When experienced commanders observe colleagues being deliberately targeted and eliminated during routine patrol operations, it inevitably influences how they conduct future missions. This psychological dimension rarely receives sustained attention in mainstream reporting because it cannot be measured as easily as casualty numbers or destroyed equipment. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that the morale and confidence of an officer corps play a decisive role in maintaining offensive momentum during prolonged campaigns. Commanders who believe they are being specifically hunted will naturally alter how they position themselves, how they communicate with subordinate units, and how aggressively they execute assigned tasks. Each individual decision may be entirely rational from a survival perspective, but collectively those adjustments reduce operational effectiveness in ways that no reinforcement program can fully overcome. The brigade commander responsible for the Lebanon Valley now faces an exceptionally complex operational challenge if these reports are confirmed. He is potentially dealing with the loss of an entire battalion as an organized fighting force. A significant gap has opened within his operational frontage, and Hezbollah would almost certainly recognize and seek to exploit that weakness before Israeli forces can restore cohesion. At the same time, commanders would be attempting to recover casualties, evacuate survivors, retrieve damaged equipment where possible, re-establish communications, and rebuild a defensive posture before the attacking force can capitalize further on its initial success. All of these tasks must be carried out simultaneously with resources that were already committed before the engagement began, and in terrain that now appears to favor the defending force far more than previous operational assessments may have anticipated. None of the available options offers an uncomplicated solution. Deploying the brigade's reserve battalion to seal the breach would restore manpower in the short term, but it would also eliminate the commander's principal reserve at a moment when Hezbollah has demonstrated an apparent ability to monitor Israeli movements with considerable precision. Moving reserve forces into predictable positions could simply create another opportunity for a carefully prepared strike. Requesting reinforcement from divisional headquarters presents a different challenge. Such a request inevitably signals that the situation has exceeded brigade-level capacity, placing additional pressure on senior commanders to authorize broader operations that may carry substantial escalation risks. Air support, traditionally one of Israel's greatest military advantages, also becomes considerably more difficult under these circumstances. When friendly forces remain intermingled with hostile positions across confined terrain, every airstrike carries a heightened risk of striking Israeli personnel. If the ambush has been designed with that constraint in mind, then limiting the effectiveness of Israeli air power may have been an integral part of the operational plan from the outset. Attention inevitably turns to Washington. Assuming the established intelligence sharing mechanisms between the United States and Israel are functioning as they normally do, American officials would almost certainly have been informed of the developing situation within minutes of the engagement beginning. For policymakers in Washington, however, the central question is not whether such an event is significant. A battle resulting in the reported loss of 22 officers and the effective destruction of a battalion would command attention under any military assessment. The more difficult question is whether the United States possesses any practical means of influencing events while they are still unfolding. The reality is that America's principal instruments of support operate at the strategic rather than tactical level. Military assistance, intelligence cooperation, weapons deliveries, diplomatic coordination, and the presence of American naval forces all contribute to Israel's broader security posture. None of those capabilities, however, can alter the outcome of a 40-minute battlefield engagement already in progress. By the time information has been assessed, decisions have been made, and responses coordinated through established command structures, the immediate tactical situation will almost certainly have been resolved by the forces already engaged on the ground. Washington's primary concern, therefore, shifts away from the battle itself and towards the risk of wider escalation. An incident involving the reported loss of so many officers creates powerful domestic political pressure inside Israel for a forceful response. Public expectations inevitably demand visible retaliation designed not only to punish those responsible, but also to restore deterrence after a significant battlefield setback. That political reality presents its own strategic dilemma. The type of response likely to satisfy domestic expectations may also be precisely the type of response most likely to widen the conflict beyond its current boundaries. Preventing that escalation is almost certainly one of the central objectives of ongoing American diplomatic engagement, even as events continue to unfold on the ground. The central challenge facing policymakers is that the very response capable of satisfying domestic political demands inside Israel may also accelerate the conflict in ways that neither Washington nor regional actors are fully prepared to contain. If Hezbollah carried out an operation of this sophistication, it is highly unlikely that it did so without anticipating Israel's reaction. The organization has spent decades studying Israeli military doctrine, operational procedures, and patterns of retaliation. Those lessons have shaped its planning at every level. Any ambush of this scale would almost certainly have been designed with the expectation that Israel would respond swiftly and forcefully. That in turn suggests Hezbollah may already have prepared follow-on defensive positions, additional firing locations, and supporting forces intended to confront any immediate Israeli counteroffensive. In other words, the initial ambush may not represent the end of the operation. It could instead be the opening phase of a broader plan intended to draw Israeli forces into a battlefield that has already been carefully prepared. Should Israel launch a rapid retaliatory operation into the same area, it would likely be entering terrain that has been studied, fortified, and rehearsed by Hezbollah over an extended period. Any force moving into that environment would face not only the original threat, but also the possibility of additional layered defenses specifically designed to exploit predictable response patterns. Beyond the immediate battlefield, military observers in other capitals will be examining this engagement with considerable interest. Moscow, for example, is unlikely to focus solely on the political implications. Russian military analysts traditionally examine conflicts through the lens of operational lessons that can be applied elsewhere. Their assessment would almost certainly concentrate on the tactical methods reportedly employed during the ambush, rather than the identities of those involved. Particular attention would be given to the apparent combination of sustained intelligence gathering, precision targeting of command elements, and simultaneous attacks launched from multiple directions across complex terrain. None of those techniques is unique to southern Lebanon. They represent military concepts that, in theory, could be adapted by any force capable of conducting prolonged surveillance, identifying command structures, and preparing concealed firing positions before an engagement begins. If the emerging reports prove accurate, analysts in Moscow would likely view the operation as another example of how disciplined preparation and accurate intelligence can offset the advantages traditionally enjoyed by a technologically superior conventional force. Beijing's assessment would almost certainly follow a different pattern. China rarely comments publicly on battlefield developments of this nature. Instead, its approach tends to emphasize quiet analysis over immediate political messaging. Behind closed doors, however, Chinese military planners closely monitor conflicts that provide insight into the performance of modern weapons, asymmetric tactics, and command structures operating under sustained combat pressure. An engagement of this scale would offer valuable information regarding precision-guided weapons, battlefield intelligence, command resilience, and the ability of a highly organized non-state actor to challenge a conventional military force. For Chinese strategists, the significance would extend well beyond Lebanon itself. Every major conflict provides operational data that may influence future planning in entirely different regions and under entirely different circumstances. Financial markets would also respond, although through a very different lens. A single engagement in the Lebanon Valley does not directly threaten global energy supplies. Yet markets rarely react only to present realities. They also price future risk. Whenever a major battlefield incident increases the likelihood of wider regional escalation, traders begin reassessing the possibility that events could eventually affect critical energy infrastructure or major shipping routes. Attention inevitably returns to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically significant maritime corridors. Although this reported ambush has no direct connection to commercial shipping, any escalation between Israel and Iranian-backed forces inevitably raises questions about Tehran's broader deterrence posture. Markets understand that if regional tensions continue to intensify, pressure could eventually extend beyond the immediate battlefield. That possibility alone is enough to influence energy prices. Every increase in the perceived probability of escalation feeds directly into the risk premium attached to global oil markets. Even where no disruption has yet occurred, uncertainty itself carries measurable economic consequences. Stepping back from the immediate reports, this developing situation also reinforces a broader strategic reality that has become increasingly apparent throughout the conflict. Hezbollah is no longer operating as a lightly organized militia responding reactively to Israeli operations. Over many years, it has evolved into a force that combines extensive battlefield experience with disciplined planning, structured intelligence collection, and increasingly sophisticated tactical doctrine. Its preparations appear to have focused specifically on countering the methods traditionally employed by the Israel Defense Forces in southern Lebanon. That includes not only weapons and defensive positions, but also detailed study of Israeli command procedures, patrol routines, and operational decision-making. If the reported ambush reflects that preparation, it should not be viewed as an isolated success achieved through favorable circumstances. Rather, it would suggest the execution of a long-developed operational concept that had been refined well before the current phase of the conflict began. That distinction matters because it changes how military planners interpret the event. A surprise victory achieved through chance tells us relatively little about future operations. A carefully prepared plan executed largely as intended suggests something very different. An organization applying capabilities it has spent years developing for precisely this type of confrontation. The reported deaths of 22 officers, if confirmed, would therefore represent more than an unusually severe battlefield loss. They would indicate that an intelligence and targeting system, built patiently over an extended period, was able to identify key leadership elements within an opposing force and engage them with remarkable speed once the operation commenced. Likewise, the reported destruction of an infantry battalion would represent more than a temporary tactical setback. It would raise wider questions about the assumptions underpinning Israeli ground operations in this sector, and whether existing operational methods remain appropriate against an adversary that appears increasingly capable of anticipating and exploiting them. Those are questions military commanders cannot ignore, particularly when the operational environment offers little opportunity to pause, regroup, or fundamentally redesign ongoing operations. The next 24 to 48 hours are therefore likely to prove critical. Events will largely be shaped by three interconnected factors: the intensity of political pressure inside Israel for a decisive military response, Hezbollah's level of preparation for that response, and Washington's ability to influence Israeli decision-making before tactical developments evolve into a broader regional escalation. At present, none of those factors appears to favor restraint. Political pressure inside Israel for visible retaliation is both immediate and understandable. Hezbollah's reported battlefield posture suggests preparation rather than hesitation. Meanwhile, American influence over operational decisions has historically been at its weakest during the immediate aftermath of significant battlefield losses, precisely when emotions and political expectations are at their highest. That combination creates an environment in which escalation can become increasingly difficult to control. Having spent decades studying how military campaigns evolve, one lesson stands out above all others. Tactical defeats rarely remain confined to the battlefield where they occur. When losses reach a certain scale, they begin to reshape operational planning, political decision-making, and ultimately, strategic direction. If the reports emerging from the Lebanon Valley are confirmed, this engagement has the characteristics of precisely that kind of event. The reported destruction of an infantry battalion and the loss of a significant number of senior officers represent the visible outcome of the battle. The deeper consequences, however, are likely to emerge over the coming days as military commanders, political leaders, and international partners assess what these developments mean for the wider conflict. The next 72 hours will therefore be especially significant. Israeli decision-makers must weigh the domestic expectation for a decisive response against the operational realities on the ground. Any retaliatory action will inevitably be judged not only by its military effectiveness, but also by its ability to restore deterrence without triggering an even broader confrontation. At the same time, Hezbollah's posture suggests an organization that is planned beyond the initial engagement. If its reported preparations are as extensive as current accounts indicate, Israeli commanders will have to assume that further operations in the same sector could encounter additional prepared positions and carefully coordinated defensive measures. That dynamic substantially increases the complexity of any follow-up operation. For Washington, the challenge remains equally difficult. The United States retains considerable influence at the strategic level through military assistance, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic engagement. Yet history demonstrates that such influence becomes considerably more limited in the immediate aftermath of major battlefield losses, when political pressure often favors rapid military action over diplomatic restraint. This creates a familiar but deeply uncomfortable reality. American officials may encourage restraint, but they cannot dictate battlefield decisions once operational momentum has shifted. As previous regional crises have shown, allies facing significant military setbacks frequently prioritize immediate security considerations over broader diplomatic calculations. That is why the coming hours deserve close attention. The interaction between Israeli political pressure, Hezbollah's reported readiness, and Washington's efforts to contain escalation will shape the direction of this conflict far more than any single official statement issued today. Each of those factors is already moving simultaneously. Israeli leaders face growing domestic expectations to demonstrate resolve. Hezbollah appears prepared for the possibility of further confrontation rather than seeking to avoid it. Meanwhile, American policymakers are confronted with the increasingly difficult task of preventing tactical developments from evolving into a wider regional crisis. Whether those competing pressures can be balanced remains uncertain. One point, however, appears increasingly clear. This is no longer simply a discussion about one ambush, one battalion, or one battlefield engagement. If the emerging picture proves accurate, it represents a moment that could influence military planning and political calculations well beyond southern Lebanon. Conflicts often reach defining moments not because of a single dramatic event, but because one engagement exposes weaknesses, assumptions, or operational realities that can no longer be ignored. Military history provides countless examples where the consequences of one battle extended far beyond its immediate casualties. The true significance became apparent only later. As commanders adjusted strategy, governments reconsidered policy, and alliances responded to changing realities. The Lebanon Valley may prove to be one of those moments. If the reported operation was executed with the degree of preparation, intelligence, and precision currently being suggested, then it reflects more than tactical competence. It points towards an adversary that has invested years in understanding its opponent, refining its methods, and preparing for precisely this type of confrontation. Equally, if Israel concludes that existing operational assumptions require revision, those changes will influence not only future operations in Lebanon, but potentially broader military planning across the region. That is why the coming days matter. The immediate headlines will focus on casualty figures, battlefield movements, and official statements. Yet the more important developments may occur behind closed doors, in command headquarters, intelligence centers, and government offices where decisions are being made about what comes next. Those decisions will shape the next phase of this conflict. The central question now is not simply what happened in the Lebanon Valley. It is how every major actor involved chooses to respond. Will Israel seek rapid retaliation, accepting the risks that accompany escalation? Will Hezbollah attempt to consolidate what it may regard as a significant operational success while preparing for the next stage of the confrontation? Can Washington use its diplomatic influence to prevent military pressure from evolving into a broader regional conflict? Those questions remain unanswered. What can be said with confidence is that this developing situation deserves careful observation rather than rushed conclusions. Reliable analysis requires evidence, patience, and a willingness to separate confirmed facts from the inevitable speculation that accompanies fast-moving conflicts. As more verified information becomes available, the full operational picture will become clearer. Until then, every assessment should be measured against the evidence rather than the emotion of the moment. For now, all indications suggest that the Lebanon Valley has become the latest focal point in a conflict whose consequences continue to expand well beyond the battlefield itself. Whether this proves to be a temporary tactical setback or the beginning of a broader strategic turning point is something the coming days are likely to reveal. That is the issue worth watching most closely. As this situation continues to unfold, one reality remains impossible to ignore. The consequences of a major battlefield engagement are rarely confined to the immediate area in which it takes place. They ripple outward, shaping military planning, political calculations, and diplomatic decision-making long after the fighting itself has ended.